and how to avoid it in today's insurance marketplace. So what is adverse selection? In simple terms, adverse selection occurs when insurers compete against one another to win new business. But one insurer has better information available to assess the true risk of that prospective business. As they say, knowledge is power. And the insurer who has more of it will do a better job of selecting and pricing risk. The remaining insurers are at a distinct disadvantage with less information to assess risk, leaving them more likely to bind higher risk policyholders at inadequate prices for the risk they are assuming. They are also less likely to bind lower risk policies by failing to match consistently their competitors' lower price offering. Adverse selection occurs in one of a couple of reasons. Either a carrier incorrectly prices the risks they are writing on their own book, or a competitor enters the market and steals the better business from everyone else. These competitors have more competitive pricing strategies for good risks, and they also know when it's time to walk away from the bad business, letting other carriers write those policies at unprofitable rates. Before we get into that, we've all seen certain instances where a carrier's loss ratio deteriorates simply because they are writing risks that have a much higher potential of blowing up. They literally don't have the tools necessary to know they are taking on risks that are going to perform significantly worse than average. It's a pure risk selection and pricing to risk issue, not necessarily a price competition issue. And even when carriers take on poor performing risks, they can still protect their loss ratio if they adequately price those risks. In order to do that, however, a carrier needs to know they are taking on a riskier portfolio to help inform their overall price level. By rank ordering policies 1 through 10, with 1 being the best performing and 10 the worst performing policies, we see how this plays out. If a carrier writes a lot of business in the 8 to 10 range and they get enough rate or price to cover the higher likelihood of losses, they'll do okay over the portfolio population. But what we see quite often is that carriers writing these policies apply rates appropriate for policies in the 4 to 6 range, or in some circumstances even the 1 to 3 range. And that spells significant trouble and possible doom for those carriers. And this leads us to the second cause of adverse selection that we see happening more often today. When a carrier with more sophisticated risks knows more about the market and individual policies than the other competitors, these carriers leverage more data to gain superior knowledge that allows them to steal business at better profit margins using more efficient and effective risk selection and pricing methods. They get very aggressive on price for policies in the 1 to 3 range and will get an adequate price for the riskier business or have the confidence to walk away and let other carriers take on those risks at inadequate price levels. The real bad news awaits carriers who don't leverage advanced data and analytics to underwrite their policies and instead trust it's going to work out in the wash. Basically, these carriers believe they can make up for bad pricing decisions by making enough good ones. It's not the most effective approach in today's marketplace, where competition is becoming much more precise in both pricing and risk selection. We often start our engagement with carriers by putting together an analysis that shows the carrier how their good risks are actually subsidizing their bad risks. And we also provide them metrics to show the carrier how vulnerable they are, how vulnerable their pricing approach is, and how vulnerable their portfolio is to a competitive threat through the use of predictive analytics. What many carriers realize is that their underwriters need different tools in order to become more precise and more consistent in their own decision making. Underwriters have a lot of different factors that they need to take into account when underwriting risk exposure. The question they face on each and every policy is, how do I weigh each one of these factors? What's important and what's less important with regard to each individual risk? In the past, the playing field was pretty even, and each carrier relied on their underwriting talent to make complex decisions based on their own knowledge and experience. But that world no longer exists, and the playing field is anything but even. Today, carriers are using predictive models to weigh variables in a highly optimized and statistically valid approach. They free up their underwriters to leverage their knowledge to evaluate the elements of an insured's business that computers can't assess. Things like, is there a new management team? Or is there a safety program in place? When carriers adopt advanced data and analytics to support their underwriters, they grow their book by writing a larger percentage of the best loss ratio business. At the same time, they also avoid the worst loss ratio business. By contrast, carriers that are falling behind end up with a policy distribution that looks a heck of a lot more like a red line. They lose their percentage of better than average policies because the more sophisticated competition stole that business by being 5 or 10% cheaper. And perhaps they even gave higher commissions for that business. Those carriers not using the more sophisticated approaches are now saddled with much higher percentage in the 8 to 10 range. The old approach of regressing to the mean and hoping it all works out in the wash is a busted strategy in today's market and a fool's errand that essentially guarantees you will be adversely selected against. But the good news is that it's an issue that can be addressed. It can be addressed by adopting straightforward yet more sophisticated tools and methodologies being used